In the previous lesson, I mentioned that there's another type of repository implementation, the abstract repository or generic repository. Up to now, I've been advocating what some call a custom repository. I've seen it called a specific repository. In other words, the methods on the repository are custom tailored to the specific needs of the domain layer class. However, there's also a popular variation on the repository pattern called the abstract repository or generic repository. In a nutshell, if you look at a repository and you think, you know what, I'm going to need one of those for each class in my domain model, and your next thought is, I bet I can just create a generic version that I could use for each concrete type, then you've pretty much got the gist of what an abstract repository is. Now, there's a few flavors of this, so I'm going to show you the ones that are interesting to me. Now, you might wonder what, if any, differences there are between the terms abstract repository and generic repository. Honestly, I have no idea. They seem to be used interchangeably. I've done a thorough search and I've checked all the books that I can find, and I really can't find any real differences. This is one of those topics that feel like the Wild West, where anything goes. At any rate, if you feel like I've missed something, you'd be my friend to point it out to me, and I'll make the appropriate changes. All right, so this first example comes from an article that we're already familiar with, this Testability and Entity Framework 1.0. And if you scroll down to the examples that we were looking at in the first place, you see that we have this public interface iRepository of T. All right, so again, the implementation seems pretty obvious. What wasn't obvious at first was why create an interface for my repositories. In other words, why are we using iRepository of T here at all? Addressing this, the author says the following here. Since the code is using an interface, iRepository of employee, for example, we can provide the code with different implementations of the interface. One implementation might be an implementation backed by Entity Framework 4 and persisting objects into a Microsoft SQL Server database. A different implementation, one that we're going to use during testing, might be backed by an in-memory list of employee objects. The interface will help to achieve isolation of the code. Okay, well, I see where he's going with all of this. Personally, I would just create iEmployee repository. It still gives you testability, and it doesn't force you to implement each of those methods. The find all, the add, the remove, and so on, and each concrete repository implementation. In other words, if I had car and product and customer and order, they would all look exactly the same and have exactly the same, because they would all be required to implement iRepository. And then therein you see the fundamental problem that I have with approaching the repository layer as essentially boilerplate code. In my opinion, the needs of the domain layer should drive the design of the repository's methods. However, here we're saying if you want a repository, if you want to be a repository, then you have to implement all of these methods. The domain might say, but I don't need all of that. And the iRepository of T would say, well, too bad. I call the shots. I tell you what you need. So the domain is no longer driving the development any longer. Okay. So let's move on from there. The first implementation never shows you the concrete implementation of iRepository of employee. So let's take a look at a different example, and you're familiar with this one too from the previous lesson. If we scroll down about halfway into this article, you'll see we get to this implementing a generic repository and unit of work class section. And under creating a generic repository, the author lists a long passage featuring a class called generic repository of T entity. All right, and the methods provide, again, a get method that we've already looked at in the previous lessons. And it implements what we called a specification repository by passing in this expression of func of T entity bool. All right. It also implements this T entity get by ID, insert, delete, an overloaded delete, and an update method. All right. So these methods closely resemble that previous repository that we looked at here. At a high level, right? There's add, remove, and so on. If nothing else, we can begin to see a pattern emerge as to what typically comprises a repository. But the largest difference is that this is a complete implementation of a generic repository. By specifying a concrete type at instantiation, you would create an instance specifically for an employee like so. var employee repository equals new generic repository of type employee. Or for a car, you might do something like this. var car repository equals new generic repository of car, and so on. So the justification for the generic repository is that, as you see here, he says creating a repository class for each entity type could result in a lot of redundant code. Well, that's definitely true. I mean, I've often talked about the dangers of redundant code in this series. So we seemingly have two principles at conflict. On the one hand, we prefer to reduce duplicate or redundant code, or adhere to dry, don't repeat yourself. On the other hand, we want the domain layer to drive the design of the repository and only implement those methods that the domain layer actually needs. By creating an I repository, in this example, or a generic repository of T entity, the domain's needs are not driving the design, but rather it's about convenience for the developers, not having to write and maintain a bunch of similar code. Now, I'll return to this implementation of the generic repository and talk about one anti-pattern that could prove potentially harmful to your attempts to stay technology agnostic in just a bit. Now, throughout this series, I've been skeptical when discussing the generic or abstract repository pattern. I'm not the only one who feels this way. Again, I'm going to return to the Sapien Works blog. I encourage you to read it. In summary, the author makes the following two arguments against a generic repository. First of all, he says, the design of the repository's interface depends on the bounded context that it applies to, so it's not possible to have a generic form. Now, I'll expand on this in the very next lesson, but it's at the heart of my skepticism why I don't think I would use an abstract or generic repository, at least if I were following a domain-driven design discipline. And then secondly, many people are just using the generic repository to wrap around the entity framework. Think about the examples that we've seen in this lesson. The entity framework already provides ways to add, update, delete, and use link to entities to search for data. In fact, some would suggest that it already implements the repository and unit of work patterns, and I suppose there's some truth to that. As a wrapper around the entity framework, you get into this situation where the domain layer classes are taking on the additional responsibility of query composition. And you'll recall at the very outset, query composition should be relegated, according to Fowler, into its own layer. In other words, they have to know a lot more about the storage than they should. Ideally, they would say, okay, I'm done. You over there, yes, you, don't tell me your name, I don't care, just shut up and store me, okay? Then the repository would worry about the persistence details and such. In my opinion, it would be better to utilize a generic repository class than no repository classes at all, and essentially treat the entity framework or some other API as the persistence layer. At the very least, it does provide an abstraction, and it makes unit testing easier, at least in my opinion. Unit testing the domain layer methods is very hard to do. It's made trickier whenever you have to account for the entity framework specific APIs. And I want to avoid that at all costs if I can. I'll talk about more about unit testing your persistence layer in a whole other series. So to recap, in this series, you learned about the style of repository that you'll see in a majority of examples on the internet. I also took the opportunity to start discussing why a generic repository might not be all that useful, but still it's better than nothing. In the next lesson, I'm going to explain a fundamental disconnect between these generic repository implementations and a repository implementation guided by domain-driven design. So hopefully that'll shed some light on exactly what my thought process is in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you.